So why don't we get started? Allison, maybe why don't you introduce who's in the room there?
Sure.
Hi, this is Yaxin Wei. I'm sitting together with Allison.
So there was nobody down here on that chapter.
At the moment, that's just the two of us, Allison and Yeshing.
Okay. Then we heard Dave, and Huying is on, and Roloff is on. So know a few more people registered. Let's see who's chatting.
Yes, they're trickling in now.
Sorry.
And we have Ranjit in the room as well.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Ranjit. So, Allison, are you guys settled? Can we get started?
Oh, just one more second.
I believe Stan Wolfsliger will be joining us too.
Okay.
But I guess we can get started.
Yeah.
All right. Can you move on to the next slide? So I hope you all saw the email that I sent out. Basically, we have up to $1 million of community funds that we have for projects to work with us. And this is money that you can use to team up with us and work with us on a particular topic of your interest, or we can, we as an ESS-DIVE team can use it to build some features that are not currently on the roadmap. So I think what we're going to do, next slide, going forward is the process we want to do is first through March, we want to gather what community's needs are for ESS-DIVE. And we'll have at least one more webinar for that. And then we'll be sending out emails and a survey, and we're getting out to some of the sites to hear directly from you. So what we'd like by April is to make sure that we are able to then rank some of these priorities. And that's what I'm hoping that the last webinar we can use it for ranking what the priorities are, but we'd also send out a Google Form survey where you can rank which ones are the most important to you. And by the cyber infrastructure meeting, we really want to make sure that we know what everybody wants and what the rankings are, because we want to start forming groups that can work with us on these priority items. So basically the process is we're going to gather needs first and then rank them and then start forming the teams who want to work on these different things. So ideally we actually, May is a little late to start the subcontract, but sort of given this timeline, we can try and accelerate it a bit, but it's going to be hard to accelerate it much further. So just so everybody knows where ESS-DIVE is right now, we started in 2017, in mid-2017. That's when the project started, and we had to transfer all the data, or just get the old archive transferred over by September, and by 2018 April, we had to go live. So we went live on 1st April 2018, accepting data sets, and by last August, we joined the Data One network. In December, we released a prototype API for uploading metadata onto, it's not for uploading, but for testing the uploads of metadata to ESS-DIVE. And I think several of you were on that call. We'll probably do at least one more demo of that API for those of you who missed it. And then we had a face-to-face meeting with our partners, NCs, in February, where we laid out some of these items on our roadmap and made sure it got into our development roadmap. So I think the plan is right now, as of May this year, we're definitely going to have a data upload API release so people can start uploading data sets for your projects to us. So that's about as far as we've gotten in terms of the roadmap for this year. And we want to be open about what the community needs before we start, committing to timelines for some of the other features. And so on the previous slide, I had a lot of community engagement visits. So we've visited several of the labs and many of you. And we're going to continue to do that. Hopefully, we're going to get out to Oak Ridge next week and then to Livermore and maybe a visit to SPAC. So hopefully we get some good direct feedback, but also give people plenty of opportunities through webinars and Google Forums to give us your feedback. So these are the things that we put out in the email that I sent out as possible things for projects to consider. We don't have to be limited to this, but these are just things that we've maybe, at least on things on the left-hand side, we have a bit more, we've given it a bit of thought, and we have made some progress to some of these things. So that's why we put these things out, because at last year's cyber infrastructure meeting, those were the items that came up as the highest priority. So this includes project spaces, and project spaces are basically the project's data collections on ESS-DIVE, but that you get to manage your data on ESS-DIVE as a project, including who uploads data and who is able to, if somebody uploads data on behalf of the project, there'll be an admin who's able to access all the data sets, so it doesn't get lost once somebody leaves the project. And it'll also have project level metrics and data usage notifications. For the ingest and export improvements, we have the API that I mentioned earlier. We've also heard bulk data transfer is very important for large files. So that's another thing we're thinking about how to implement. And then we heard from the MSL team, and actually several other people have brought up the fact that when you have really large data, sometimes it doesn't make sense to transfer all of the data files onto ESS-DIVE, and that you want to leave it at its original source as long as the source is a reliable archive, and that we just provide a link to the canonical data source. So that's what the link to other archives is. And we haven't quite figured out how to do that, but that is something we know people want. And then in terms of standards development, Joan has been working on sample IDs and tracking and what sorts of metadata. So using global unique sample identifiers so that you can provide metadata for samples and have be able to link data for samples on ESS-DIVE. So that's what she's been thinking about. File level metadata is, right now we have a package level metadata that we require all contributors to provide when you upload data. But then this is sort of the next level where you describe how individual files are structured so that we're then able to automatically parse some of those files and extract the data that's within the data files. So that obviously can be pretty large given the number of data types we have. So we'd want to focus on something that was easy to get us started. And then finally, we know that there are several people who want to be able to submit netcdf files and have that be parsed. So this that's also, we pull that out as a separate topic because that's not necessarily just file level metadata. And then on the right, these are things that we haven't really gotten very far yet because we do need some of these other things to be done. And so right now, many people have told us that if you, right now in the ESS-DIVE website, if you have folders embedded in your files, you can't upload the entire folder. What you would have to do is you'd have to zip, if you want to preserve the directory structure. So you'd have to zip it up and then submit the file if you want to preserve that structure. And so how to represent hierarchical data packages is something where you have hierarchical files and then some packages within packages. Those are all, at least the packages within packages is right now supported in the current software. But hierarchical data formats for directories is not. So we need to know if that's a priority. And then finally, we had this idea that we would have a Fusion database, basically where the data submitted in these files in the packages is then extracted so that we're able to start doing advanced queries and visualization within that. But that's highly dependent on having agreed upon file level metadata standards and having people submit to us in those standards. So these were some of the items we wanted you to consider, but we recognize there may be things we missed. And so if you want to go into any particular topic in further detail, we have a few slides if you're interested in finding out a bit more. And our team, who's Deb is on the line, and Joan, who's our postdoc working on standards, Val, who's our lead software engineer, Hesham, who's another software engineer. I think we have a large team presence here, so we should be able to answer most of your questions regards to any of these topics. And we want to hear from you if there are other things we should consider. So with that, I'll open it up to anybody who wants to talk. I believe I've given everybody access to be able to talk. But ping us in chat if you're not able to be heard, if you think you're not being heard.
Yeah, I am personing, I guess, the chat. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be making sure those questions get relayed.
And Deb, did you have anything to add before we open it up to everybody?
No, I think you covered it well. I think the main subtlety, the MSIL folks, Dave Millard had pointed out that we shouldn't just think about file level metadata. It's also directory level metadata if we've got in a hierarchy of files. So that's one subtlety missing from the list. But yeah, we really want to hear from all of you what you want to be the priorities and what you want to help work on.
Hey, at Oak Ridge, we have had some discussions about your email that listed out pretty much the same list, I guess, that you presented here. So we have identified 3 priorities that we thought were important off of that list. The first was the NetCDF file representation. I mean, maybe it's because we are all big fans of NetCDF between ARM and the DAC, but we happen to have a member of the Earth Data Standards Office here who's in charge of issuing standards for NASA NetCDF format data. And we can provide a lot of input on general rules and specific community standards for NetCDF format and extracting granular level or file level metadata. As you say, it's pretty easy as long as everyone follows the standard.
Right, so the NASA, as this, the Earth Science Data Information System has so-called ESS-DIVE Standards Office. And the role of that office is to identify those community standards that can help NASA Earth Science data systems to, for example, capture information in standards, standardized data formats, metadata formats, and also other best practices that can help NASA Earth data systems to manage data. So I'm currently serving in that standards office, and the NetCDF, as long as the CF Climate and Forecast Convention have been adopted by the ESS-DIVE Standards Office as the recommended formats and metadata conventions to represent a lot of different types of NASA observation data, including modeling data. And here at ORNL, we also have a lot of experience of leveraging NetCDF and some community standards to manage data produced by, for example, model intercomparison projects, as well as airborne observation projects, as well as some in-situ observation data that ARM contains. So we do have a lot of experiences with using those different types of formats and standards. And we, of course, identified some issues when we try to apply those standards in the data that we manage. We have to work together with the entire community to help to improve those formats and standards. So basically, we do have some experience that we may be able to help here.
Mm-hmm. And then we had two other priorities out of your list that we thought were important. One of them was what you called on the slide, the project spaces. I think it was called like custom data package administration support in the email. But basically, we thought that this was really important, and it takes some of the guesswork out of how an existing project should or could interact with ESS-DIVE in a really like structured way, instead of it just being a collection of individual researchers uploading their data. Because the projects, I think, still have an important role to play in organizing their data before it's submitted to ESS-DIVE, and enforcing some standards and curation at the project level.
That sounds great. Allison, just as a question, would it be important for you to have workflows for submissions where you have like an administrator who's able to approve packages within your project to publish? Is that something that's important, or is that something that would be nice but not essential?
I would put it in the second category, that it's nice. I think it's more of the just notification and visibility of what the project members are doing, rather than having to go through and approve everything.
Okay. Thanks. And you had one more item?
Yes, and the third one was just the standardized file level metadata. That's something that we have expertise in here at Oak Ridge between ARM and the DAC, and we could provide general or project-specific guidance depending on the types of data that you're dealing with based on our previous experience. And I think it's really, we could do a test case where we start with a project here that we're familiar with, like NG Arctic or Spruce, and we develop file level metadata for that project and then try to generalize it into a standard that could be used for other projects. So I think that would be a really close partnership, but it seems like an area that we could easily contribute.
So Charu, this is Ranjit. I would just want to add one other thing there. So on your slide, data ingest and export improvements, linked to data on other archives. That's something that we have a lot of experience on, with our, experience with Mercury search system. So I haven't seen that bullet before, so I guess we can add that as a priority as well. That's something that we can help with.
Yeah, it wasn't in my email because Dave had reminded us in response to my email that this was a priority for him. So Dave Millard from EMSL, who's very keen on having that enabled.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. And it's quite complementary, I think, to our what we've been working on. Is there anybody else who wants to go next?
This is Dave Moulton. I have a couple of, maybe it's more of still in the form of a question. I don't have a specific need within the broader question I'm going to ask, but if it gets too noisy here, let me know. I'll turn off. But can you guys hear me okay at the moment?
Yes.
Okay, so it would be great to start to drive some of this towards being able to integrate and handle model inputs. There was at least a mention of the work that's been done at Oak Ridge, I guess, in relation to the ILAM project and other model intercomparison projects. But it doesn't have to be the big super uber models, to start, but starting to develop requirements and design concepts and even maybe prototype something of how ESS-DIVE is going to interact more directly with the modeling community, I think is important to start to get in here.
Thanks, Dave. And you had something else?
No, I know that's the primary one. I mean, I guess the question starts to grow into, you know, does it fit in with anything specific at this point? Is it part of something related to project spaces? Is there, you know, is there some elements of provenance tracking and other things that also need to be developed in support of this? But yeah, I think it depends a little bit on, I guess, who else is interested in and where to get started. I think it's just important to identify some areas and to get things moving in that direction because the model data integration is critical.
So one suggestion when we were considering model data was that it might make sense for sort of having a workshop on model data, a DOE type workshop where, you know, we get people who are interested together. Is that something that makes sense to do? As you know, if we're starting to think about it, we could use potentially some community money to just organize a workshop. I just want to hear people's thoughts on, you know, whether that's
a great idea to involve different user communities in such a workshop, like modelers and data producers, and also application developers like those who are involved in the ILAM activity. I think this kind of a broad discussion will be very helpful. And when we were dealing with previous model in comparison project, challenges always arise in terms of there's always gaps between the modelers and those researchers who want to leverage their model results to do whatever analysis and evaluation in comparison. Bring those different users together, have some discussion. That will be a very good start.
Hey, this is Barry.
And I'm very happy that David had brought the ILAM up. I think that's a very good connection as a bridge that can connect the different communities together. So those efforts that we want to do, for example, develop file level metadata and metadata file representation, make sure those files and the metadata records, they can connect with applications like ILAM will be a great thing.
So I had a question. Since we are talking about NetCDF file representations and stuff like that, is like data analytics or any sort of data subsetting or like visualization, are those kind of things out of scope for this right now? Or are you guys thinking that that could be of any help?
I'll answer for that one. Yeah, those certainly could be within scope. I think the challenge, I mean, that I mean, the Fusion database is already something we're supposed to be working on. So I think having some partnership on that would be fantastic.
Yeah, like we have a lot of like variable extraction kind of, experience from NetCDF file. Like we use like open community-based tools like threads and OpenDAP that could readily interact with our NetCDF files. So those kind of things are easily integratable. So maybe you could use experience from some DAG and ARM.
Yeah, I think those potential activities on those different aspects, eventually they will all interconnect with each other. Like we have the good NetCDF file representation, good file level metadata, they shall be able to plug into the open tools like Ranjit mentioned, and also ideally we'll be able to easily interoperate with domain applications like ILAM or the data analytics tools that the research community already set up. I mean, I'm really looking at a whole integrated solution here.
No, that sounds great. This is definitely something we want to collaborate on.
Maverick was trying to say something earlier.
Oh, can you guys actually hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, I guess I apologize if you guys already talked about this because I came online a little late, but I'm trying to get a better sense of, you know, what space within data ESS-DIVE is trying to capture. So, you know, in the website, it talks about observational, experimental, and modeling research data. But it seems like the focus, at least at this point, is primarily on capturing observational data. Am I interpreting that correctly? Or is there, you know, as David Moulton suggested, capturing modeling data or modeling research data and more laboratory experimental data also part of the mix at this point?
Yeah, so the laboratory experiment is definitely part of the mix at this point. I think the question with model data is it's a big data problem, and the question is how big you know, the files that modelers want to store become, because we're kind of size limited, and so that's really one of our bottlenecks to taking model data. Apart from I think the fact that, you know, how to make that data be usable is also sort of a hand-in-hand discussion.
Right. I mean, my sense is that those three categories of data are, in terms of size of the data sets, will be maybe orders and orders of magnitude. Could vary by many orders of magnitude. And so how do you set up a structure that enables the storage of both relatively small data sets as well as much, much larger data sets? I think that's really challenging because I think that the needs are going to be quite different.
Yeah, Deb, are you going to take that, or should I take that?
I was waiting to see whether you wanted to try and answer it. No, Maverick, that's a great point. And basically, our approach in working on this, you're right. We started with the observational data because that was where the greatest open need was at the time we started. But we're very much about working with you all, the community, to address whatever the priorities are. And if the need is to focus on model data next, which is what we're hearing is one of the pieces of that, we have the ability to deal with the scale. We just you know, I think it's a conversation with the program as to how we want to do it, but it's not out of our technical scope to deal with the scale issues. It's just we took the convenience of that the prior archive was quite small and only proposed a relatively small archive to begin with, just to give ourselves the time to get ramped up and started. But since we're homed at NERSC, there is a lot of capacity and capability there. We aren't yet utilizing it. And we would love to work with you to talk about how that happens. I mean, the whole idea of this conversation is to figure out who wants to work with us on these various problems and figure out then how we want to proceed on those. Because as we've said all along, this is about being a community archive and doing this together.
Yeah, actually, my interest is a little bit out in left field, but we have a project here where we're interested in developing compilations of mineral water interface reactions, and this is it's in part related to our SBR project, but it's a broader interest for contaminant transport, radionuclide transport, nutrient cycling, and it's one of these sets of it's a quantity of data that's certainly not sort of within the big data realm. But I've been sort of scratching my head thinking, should we be trying to figure out a way that some of that work could be captured within ESS-DIVE rather than, building our own database system? Or, how could we make it more open source for other folks that might be interested in populating their models with mineral water interface reactions? Or is, I sort of go back and forth. Is it worth the effort, or are the data sets so small that it's not really amenable to capture within ESS-DIVE? Because really essentially it's trying to capture experimental data, but it's relatively small data sets.
So I'm assuming Charu has something to say about this, since this is one of her research areas. But I'll start with answering. From my perspective, as long as it's ESS, it can be categorized as ESS data, we're very interested. And I think that, honestly, that's one of the areas where I have really wanted to go after, is thinking about how do we characterize experiment data so that it's clear for the user that this data was generated through experiment and should not necessarily be treated as if it was pristine in situ observations.
Right.
And certainly the water chemistry and things like that are within the purview, because that's part of ESS science, to be something that we need to be able to address. And so I think it's within our scope to work with you to try to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are many projects that are generating experimental data, and we haven't really. I mean, that's not on this list right now. Is how file level metadata is kind of broad, and we didn't really break it up into categories there. But how sort of one would define experiments and methods and setup, that's not something we've really discussed until this point, and it's really important for this space. So I do think I agree with Deb that is under our scope for this money.
Yeah, I think it's just it's from a metadata standpoint, it's a lot more difficult than a met station or some observational point in space and within space and time, where the data sets are coming in, but they're very well structured. But it'd certainly be interesting to, right? I mean, it's challenging, which means it could be interesting, but it's not an easy problem.
I'd like to suggest that the experimental data could be handled quite easily in ESS-DIVE from my impression of the metadata model that they're using. I think it's a matter of just going you know, just trying it out and seeing what you can actually get out of this metadata model that they're using. And then once there's one data set in place, it's kind of a guide, it's a precedent for how everyone else can follow, and more and more people can put in data that's derived from experimental scenarios. So I think perhaps a group of people who would tackle, you know, populating that very first experimental metadata record, that could be a priority, because it would pave the way for a lot of other people to share their data as well.
Yeah, I'm with Allison. I think it's probably a good practice to start with some specific types of measurements, because good representation of the metadata for those different data can be a big challenge if we are talking about a model that's useful for all different types of data. That's definitely a big challenge. And if we start from that directly, then maybe too difficult. Maybe a good thing to start with some specific types of measurements. Let's just get started and work on it, and we'll identify some things that may be useful for other types of data, and we may also identify some challenges and let's try to solve the problem from there.
Right, because you guys have some large-scale experiments like the warming and CO2 enrichment things going on that I think would also be conducive to working with figuring out a generalized way of how we label experiments.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is roll-off. I mean, at some moment a while back, we actually looked at some of that stuff at INL and at PNNL, where we looked at similar kind of issues, and I would actually argue for a more narrow view, where one would say, let's first articulate maybe because the problem is, say you have a column experiment in lab, it's a very different experiment from like a infiltration of like at the rifle or a warming experiment. Essentially you have all these, you know, different forcing functions you apply to a system over there, and how you describe these forcing functions, how you describe it in space, turns out to be super, super complicated, and all the boundary conditions and that kind of stuff there. So even, but I think it's great to do it, but I would argue for saying, well, let's say, what is one of the more common experiments one does? And for instance, experiments which happen at a lot of places across the labs are column experiments. And I think maybe like saying, okay, can we describe a column experiment? And then which requires you to describe a column and the material of the column and the boundary conditions and all that kind of stuff there. So I would say, you know, from what I've worked at like a while before, and we never really got anywhere conclusive, is something where you identify a common interest and do that. I think you'll learn a lot from it rather than trying to get a generalized model. But that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks, Roloff. I think, I mean, distinguishing between lab and field experiments is pretty critical when you're, you know, trying to develop the metadata. I do notice that most people actually are not utilizing some of the metadata fields that we have even at the package level, which describes methods and describes, you know, you can describe your experimental setup, even in our current structure. And most of the people who, you know, would just say, you know, refer to this paper that's attached, which means that by default doesn't become searchable and indexable. But that is, you know, a challenge is to get people to provide us that metadata, even if the space exists there.
So if I can, given that this is the priority gathering meeting, I guess I kind of want to drag us back up a level and hear from others if there are other thoughts about other things you want to see in the priority list, or if there are things on our list that you want to at least sort of throw in a straw about.
This is Bruce from Oak Ridge. A slightly different thread was your comment on sample IDs tracking and sample metadata. There was a session on that at the ESIP meeting. Kirsten Lenhart from Lamont Doherty led that, and she would have the notes there. I think that's another area where people are starting to ask some questions, particularly for the tracking as it relates to samples that are not necessarily time stable, which is, IGSN was really targeting more time stable samples than other kinds of things, and ESS-DIVE might be able to participate in a broader conversation there rather than necessarily having to do something that's more specific to that particular mission. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, and it's actually something that a lot of people, they're not on this call, but others have written to me in response to that email, is sort of sample tracking is a big issue for many of the projects. And I think you're right, is, for samples that are evolving or are not necessarily permanent, we should, think about it. But Joan has been in touch with Kirsten, and actually we're having a follow-up call with them sometime in March to see how, what they have done so far applies to our data types and whether there's, gaps that we need to address.
There were several different types of providers in that, and I'm happy to chip in. I spent 18 years in industry, and one of my major Six Sigma projects was dealing with sample tracking. So I can tell you at least some things that work and some that don't work.
That's great. And I didn't catch your name.
This is Bruce Wilson from Oak Ridge. I'm back as the ORNL DAC manager.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Deb would remember me from my previous incarnation.
I'd already written down the Wilson. Yeah, no, nice to hear from you, Bruce.
Good to catch up with you again, ma'am.
Yeah, and this is Joan. I'm the postdoc who started recently in December working on data standards. And one of the things that I've been doing a little bit of research on is the sample identification and tracking, and have come to the conclusion that IGSN is really good for certain types of physical samples, and can also be applied to like the like sites and sample features when you're dealing with time series data, for example. But it would be good to talk more about that if you're interested.
Sure, but particularly when you talk with Kirsten, ask her for what she picked up from that ESIP workshop.
Okay.
So one thing that I did not put here, but I wanted to offer, because we are able to do it, is the ability to offer data management training to groups, because our partners, NCs, do have really nice packages of tutorials that they are able to offer, or workshops, if that's what the community wants, where they're able to train project members who attend the workshop to be able to submit data in in a format that makes that is usable. So is that something that's of interest? Because we could organize a training of that sort too, if there's broad interest in it.
Well, Charo, I think it's a great idea for you to poll the actual scientific user community. Those of us here in the room, I don't think need the training, but yeah, if your Google poll goes out and you have a lot of people who are interested in the training, that does seem like a good thing for you to offer.
And this is, Bruce, again, the question that I would ask about that, and I can argue either side of the equation, is how much that should be done in collaboration with something like the Carpentries, the data carpentry folks.
Exactly.
How much do we leverage? And this would be, for example, a data carpentry workshop offered with a particular bent to it. That might have the best value to the community.
Right, and I think, Bruce, I mean, that's a great point, and Allison, you've made some great points. I think we recognize that there's a lot of good data management training out there already. And so, yeah, a lot of our interest is in identifying some of those that we want to utilize, and then providing some funding to help enable those to be offered within the ESS community. is certainly our goal, rather than generating on yet another data management class.
So, Deb, by data management training, you're talking about sort of in the broadest sense, not sort of the application to ESS-DIVE specifically. Is that, do I have that right?
I view the application to ESS-DIVE specifically as only a minor addition to the broader data management training that we really need to have happen. I think as we evolve standards and different components of what we want our community to do, we would certainly want those to be part of the training and introduced as part of the training. But I view it as almost a more minor component than just teaching this community to do good data management, period. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. I think it's just for those of us that don't live and breathe within the space of large data, we tend to be lazy, and if we're not spoon-fed how to if we're not sort of coaxed into better data management or the opportunities that ESS-DIVE might provide, we would tend to be lazy and just go on doing things the way we've been doing things. So I think, there is a lot of benefit to going out there and advertising what the program has to offer, and giving people, making it easier for people to start implementing some basic data management practices.
We're definitely open to suggestions on how we do that, because I think most people are resistant to change from their normal practices. And often in this space, people are sort of focused around, I collect the data, I use the data, and it's a tough transition to moving to, I collect the data and many of us use the data.
I think that's particularly true from the experimental data standpoint, where, I think observational data in general, the folks that are using that data have already sort of adopted this philosophy, but you actually have to go through the trouble of convincing the community that's more focused on experimental data that there is something to be gained from capturing that experimental data in some form that's actually can be accessed not just by them in their laboratory, but by a broader community.
Maverick, I'm a little bit surprised to hear that, because I would imagine experimentalists would need to provide reproducibility to their experimental findings, and sharing the data that you use to come to conclusions would be one way to show, that the experiment did actually produce the results that you're claiming. I don't know if that might be a carrot for people to share data.
I think it's a good carrot, but you'd be surprised how little people, it's actually a good topic to bring up, because you'd be surprised at how much people produce their own data and don't put it within the context of similar data that have already been published. That's a pet peeve that I have, that I force my postdocs to deal with, is that your data is much less valuable if it's not placed within the context of previously published data, similar previously published data. And the only way to build that context is to actually have that data accessible in some form or fashion. But people tend to be lazy, and manually extracting data from papers and then doing something useful with them is not, it's not a fun process.
Yeah, I hear you. Using a ruler to measure a graph is just not So we have 5 more minutes. So this has been really great discussion. I just wanted to offer anybody who's not spoken up. I think we heard from everybody, but I don't know if Rola, if you had any other priorities you wanted to add, because you sort of commented with respect to something else. But is there something you needed to chip in here?
No, I don't. I think that most of the priorities obviously are set by the DOE lab. So I'm more interested in the implementation end. So I think all these things sound good. So I don't really have anything to add there.
Okay, and if any of you think of anything that you forgot to mention, we're always open, and you can shoot us an email, or hopefully we'll get those surveys out. We just wanted to get a set of topics put together. So it sounds like we were not completely off the ballpark on these topics, and we just have a few more to add that can then go out as a survey. And the second webinar, I think, will be like follow-on discussion. I'm hoping that some of the people who wrote emails about some of the other topics that they care about will also come and provide input on that. And then I think the final webinar in April, we'll definitely try to nail down some high priority topics that we can present. And it's pretty close to the cyber infrastructure meeting. I think it's just a week before that. So I think we do want to make sure that when we're at that meeting that we really get community consensus, and that we're able to go ahead and start the process of allocating money to whichever groups want to work with us after that meeting, because it'll get pretty late if we wait beyond that. Deb, any final words?
No, I just want to thank everybody for their input. Really appreciate it.
All right, well, thank you. This has been a really cool conversation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Looking forward to the next one. I'll think about some more of this before then. We'll talk to some more folks.
Great. Thanks for doing that.
Thanks.
That was like, and turn the page. Or carry, yeah, all those books, or the books.